Meet Irene. She was born in a large family of Irish peasants. But the Great Famine in Ireland in the 1840s forced her to go to London in search of work, like thousands of other poor people. She hoped that her life would get better there and she would be able to help her parents and younger siblings. But on the very first day it became clear it is not easy to find a job there. The 19th century was a golden one for Great Britain. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, the country became a world economy leader. Inhabitants of the villages massively moved to the capital. As a result, the population of London tripled during the century. Because of this huge inflow of workers, it was very difficult to find a permanent job. Poor people could only hope that the next day they would find some part-time job, like helping to move a heavy load, fix furniture, beat carpets, wash, and so on. A permanent place to stay was just an unaffordable luxury. It was believed that you had achieved real success in life if you rent a bed, even sharing it with someone, in a room with other hard workers. The streets of London and other big cities were crowded with homeless people. So, Irene didn't find a job by the evening. She had no one in London and almost no money either. What had she to do? Where could she find a place to stay for the night? She couldn't go to the embankment and sleep on a bench. She was chased away by a patrol. London laws forbade sleeping on the street. The cheapest and most popular overnight stay cost 1 penny. For that money, you got a sitting place on a bench in a large hall filled with long wooden benches. In the night, such establishments were completely packed with the poor. But it was forbidden to sleep there. For your penny, you could only sit there all night long in the dry place and not get wet in the London rain. There was no heating either, so in general the room wasn't much warmer than outside. The keepers didn't allow the guests to fall asleep. Almost everyone could scrape together enough money for such a peculiar overnight stay. Well, what about sleeping? It costs 2 times more to sleep, 2 pennies. And if you think that it looked like that, then you couldn't be more wrong. That's how the lucky people slept, literally tied up with a rope in those establishments, but they slept. Late in the evening, guests sat down on the bench. In front of them was stretched a long, thick rope. They could lean on it and sleep. Early in the morning, at 5 or 6 in the morning, the caretakers cut off the ropes and people simply fell to the floor. They were not gentle with beggars in Victorian England. There was cold too, so the guests often froze to death by morning. Well, so-called coffins were a paradise. For 4 pennies you could rent a sleeping place in a wooden box, resembling an ordinary coffin. Here you were already given hot drinks and a small snack, and the room was heated. But the armies of lice were waiting for the poor. They literally ate the poor at night and didn't let them sleep. For a week now, Irene had been walking the streets of London looking for work, but she couldn't find anything. She could only take odd jobs. Our protagonist had been sleeping on a bench for 1 penny all week. A couple of times she was lucky with part-time jobs during the day, and she was able to sleep leaning on the ropes. How did she find London? Firstly, it was impossible to live there because of the famous London fogs. The situation was greatly complicated by smoke from coal stoves. Here is how the American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, who visited London at that time, described them. It's like being placed in a liquefied yellow pea pudding, which is not dense enough to get stuck in the throat, but so intrusive and inevitable that you grab a large portion of it every time when making your way through it and gasping for air. Besides, London was wildly, unbearably stinking. Today it is difficult even to imagine that stench in London of the 19th century. The provincials who came to London complained that the streets stank worse than a stable, but this was the center. The back streets of the East End smelled even more disgusting. Even by the end of the 19th century, there was one toilet on the street for 16 houses. And it's not just about the city slums. Next to the Parliament building in the Westminster district, one toilet served the entire street where 30-40 people lived in each house. As a result, in overpopulated dwellings, people relieved themselves anywhere, on stairs, in courtyards, etc. Or even right in the middle of the room, they made a hole in the floor and defecated there. Hard workers almost didn't wash themselves and didn't wash their clothes neither. Richer girls armed themselves with hand tongs on the streets not to get their hands dirty, and enterprising boys ran in front of young ladies and swept the dirt from the road for a penny. Terrible unsanitary conditions caused cholera epidemics that mowed down entire neighborhoods. But the biggest problem was the dilapidated state of the sewer system. In 1848, it was in critical condition, but nothing was done. All the sewage flowed into the Thames. From the river, supposedly clean water came to water fountains, and Londoners drank it. They had to take water in a Pay Street pump. There was a long queue for the pumps, especially since in some areas they functioned only twice a day, and only on work days. And the summer of 1858 went down in history as the Great Stink of London. The sewers collapsed and the stinking, fetid, feces slime ended up in the Thames at high tide. Then it went upstream and descended with the ebb, finally polluting the banks of the river. In addition, the Thames became shallow because of the heat, so only sewage streams flowed through it instead of water. London was terrified. The citizens massively tried to escape from the capital. Passers-by used to faint from the stench. Omnibus passengers shouted to the coachman to speed up, otherwise they could suffocate in the carriage. To get rid of the smell, the curtains were constantly soaked in chlorine, but it didn't help. Doctors warned that a terrible epidemic was about to begin. The law on the water pipeline construction and reconstruction was adopted rapidly, in 18 days. But let's go back to Irene. She was supported by odd jobs, but not had enough sleep for a month and eat almost nothing. But then she met an older woman. She was also Irish and came from Irene's homeland, but she had been living in London for a long time. She took our protagonist under her care. Finally, with the help of a friend, both women were able to find a permanent place as seamstresses in a dressmaking studio, and it was an incredible success. Well, it would look like a success. But instead, she found herself in the slums of London. If you think that the slums are a place for poor idlers, then you are deeply mistaken. In Victorian England, small merchants and workers lived in urban slums. Carpenters, masons, shoemakers, dressmakers, laundresses, weavers, butchers, movers. Considering the wild overabundance of labor on the streets of the city, they worked for pennies, but it was a permanent job. And finally, a permanent roof over your head. This is how Charles Dickens described the slums and their inhabitants. For those who are not familiar with this part of London, and there are many of them, it is difficult to imagine all the dirt and poverty that reigns there. Squalid houses, broken windows are sealed up with rags and paper, and where whole families huddled in every room, and sometimes 2 families or even 3. There are Irishmen in the corridor, a musician in the dining room, a day laborer and her 500 children in the kitchen. London was not infinite, of course. All the newcomers needed accommodation. There was a wild shortage of housing, although everything that had a roof at least was rented out. Sheds, barns, stables, cellars were rented out. By the mid-Victorian era, this had become a huge problem at the state level. As a result, most of the hard workers rented not a room but just a corner in it. As a result, the living conditions of today's migrants would seem a paradise for 19th century Londoners. Several families lived in one room. People were cramped into miserable shacks like herrings in a barrel, and of course there was no question of any hygiene. The inhabitants of the slums didn't know what bed linen was. They slept on dirty mattresses in their clothes. The rooms were simply infested with bedbugs, cockroaches, lice, and rats. In his report on the living conditions in working-class homes, Lord Shaftesbury noted, "The effect of the one-room system is physically and morally impossible to describe. You go into a room and see only one bed there, on which sleeps the whole family, consisting of a father, mother, an adult son or daughter, and smaller children of both sexes. It is impossible even to predict the fatal result of such an unhealthy moral climate. In many cases, adult sons or daughters sleep in the same room with other inhabitants, who often have drunk friends or girlfriends at night. All these facts lead to an increasing immorality among the working class. In winter, such houses were not heated. The owners saved on coal, or the residents didn't have money for heating even. They cooked on the street by public bonfires late at night, or by a baker who baked bread day and night. Then, in the evenings, a queue would line up at his door from those who wanted to cook their products in his huge vat of jelly after a working day. The owners of the jelly didn't mind. The broth became richer. But such well-fed days were rare in working families. More often, they got a piece of stale bread and a mug of water for dinner. Our protagonist earned from 8 shillings a week, while half of her weekly salary was spent on rent. Due to the high demand for housing, the landlords charged such prices that the workers couldn't get out of poverty. Even in the second half of the 19th century, there was appalling poverty in England everywhere, from large industrial cities to tiny villages. But what about Irene's work itself? The working conditions were often appalling. Although the Zinger sewing machine appeared in the 19th century, it was not cheap. Seamstresses worked from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. The owners of expensive ateliers tried to squeeze more out of their workers and pay less. If the women tried to make their own orders, it was even more difficult to work. From their weekly earnings, Irene had to pay for the rent of a sewing machine, for lubrication for it, and for threads. Add candles to this, especially in winter when it gets dark earlier. The work of a seamstress is partly seasonal. It happened that for several months our friends could remain almost without orders. But as soon as the season began and the ladies upgraded their looks, dressmakers worked day and night, sometimes fainting from exhaustion. She couldn't save money for a rainy day or send her family in Ireland. She barely had enough for rent and food. Sometimes she could eat only a herring and drink a cup of tea in a day. She could afford meat only once every 6 months. As a result, many seamstresses couldn't stand such life and went to the streets. One or another story of a seamstress who was forced to become a prostitute just to survive appeared in the Times newspaper. In October 1843, an article was published in the Times about a seamstress who pawned a customer's dress to buy food for her starving baby. A real hysteria began in society. For feminists of that time, it was the poor seamstress who became a symbol of the hypocrisy of Victorian society, which limited women in choosing a profession and forced them to work hard at low-paid jobs, which at the same time. When Irene completely gave up, she was unexpectedly lucky. The son of a baker from a nearby bakery fell in love with her and proposed to her. She got married and lived comfortably, more or less. And she was even able to help family in distant Ireland. She lived a long life. Well, what about that England we see on the pages of novels? How could all these sentimental and puritanical rich people look at the torment of the poor? Of course, the inhabitants of the prestigious areas of London were very worried about the inhabitants of the slums. They just shuddered with disgust at the thought that some hungry people live nearby. You never know what the poor are doing in their tiny flats. Maybe they are plotting evil. And anyway, it's their own fault that they live like this. It's all their laziness and drunkenness. If they worked, prayed, and remained sober, then... So, a well-fed man finds it difficult to understand a starving one. Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. Oh, and click on the bell so you get notified when the new episode comes out.